So my name is Jeff Lumpkin. I work at Microsoft on the Power BI team. It's the engineering team, so I'm quite proud to say that because I'm not an engineer. I'm just a finance guy who slipped my way into engineering. I started at Microsoft in 2000 as an analyst. I had several roles as financial controller, business controller in Singapore, in the US, and in Germany. So it's been a very fun career. I began presenting at Microsoft's Executive Briefing Center in 2015. The first presentation was to a bank from Lebanon called Bank Audi. At the end of that presentation, the CIO invited me to come to Beirut and work with his SQL team to develop some BI solutions. And much to his surprise, I accepted. So 3 weeks later, I landed in Beirut, very nervous for a couple of reasons. One, I was in Beirut. The second is that I didn't know if I was going to be successful working with these teams because I'm not technical. I have no SQL. I've learned a bit, but I have really no SQL skills. Over the course of 3.5 days, we produced 2 analytics that team had been struggling for 4 months to make in other tools. And so it was very successful. And that kind of hooked me on working directly with customers. So coming out of the finance back office and being out in front. I spent the next year or so presenting the EBC. If I found a customer that I liked in a geography that I liked, I would offer to come on site and work with them, and then I'd have to go beg my manager to give me a week to do this. Eventually, I parlayed that into a full-time role with the engineering team. So now this is what I do full-time, is I travel around the world and work with customers to help them use Power BI successfully. What I'm going to do today is I have a few slides talking about my approach towards storytelling with data. And then I have 2 demonstrations that I'm going to do. The first will be combining Azure machine learning with Power BI with Excel. The second is actually coming just out of Excel. I hope that you'll feel free to ask me questions. We have 2 mics on either side. So at the end of my slides, we can have a question period at the end of each demo. Also build in some questions. With that, I will get started. So I think, why is storytelling important? Because storytelling is, I think, the best way that there is to convey information. It is a way to transmit information, but also transmit understanding and transmit culture. So cultures are built on the shared stories of those cultures. And before there was the written word, people were sharing their history, their tradition, and creating a cohesive society. So that part of our shared culture, I think, should be present today much more than it is. And I sat through 15 years of reviews in finance where my peers, and myself as well, just read numbers off a spreadsheet or read numbers off a PowerPoint slide. And after 15 minutes, you maybe have all seen this, is people lean back in their chairs and they start to fall asleep. What I try to do now when I'm doing business reviews is to be very concise, but have a coherent narrative from beginning to end where I'm able to bring my business partners on a journey with me so that at the end, we've reached a shared understanding about what is most important for us to focus on as an organization, what are the steps we need to take to propel ourselves forward, and my suggestions for concrete ways in which to do that. So here's a very simple example of a story. This is my family's vineyard. It's in the state of Oregon, so it's about 4.5 hours drive south of here. We bought this land in 1999, so we have 40 acres of fruit that we've planted. In 2006, I quit Microsoft and I moved down here with my wife from Singapore and my young son. He was 2 years old. Now on the vineyard, we mostly have Pinot Noir, which is kind of the predominant fruit in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. We also have some other varieties. So we had Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, and we had 2.5 acres of Riesling. And the reason why we had Riesling is that my father had served in the U.S. Army in 1960 and 61, based in Germany. So his first taste of wine ever, he was a farm boy from Eastern Washington, first taste of wine ever was drinking German Riesling. And he came back to the U.S. with a dream of one day making his own wine. 40 years later, he sold his construction company, and my father, brother, and I bought this land together. So I went through what my wife says was a pre-midlife crisis. I quit Microsoft and moved down to the vineyard with my son and my wife, Roisin, and spent 2.5 years here learning the grape growing business and the winemaking business. We also learned we were not going to get rich in either one of those businesses, hence my return to Microsoft. But when my father finally decides that he doesn't want to do this anymore, then I at least have the knowledge that it will take to run these businesses. Now in 2012, we made the difficult decision to rip out the 2.5 acres of Riesling. And the reason why we had to is that it was not a very successful product line for us, and I'll show you why. So these 2 lines show the price per ton for Pinot and the price per ton for Riesling. 2 things that I think are fairly evident here. We get much more revenue selling Pinot than we do selling Riesling. Second, Pinot appreciated at a much faster rate than did Riesling. So in 2012, we ripped out that Riesling. We regrafted on Chardonnay and more Pinot Noir. So it cost us $60,000 in labor and materials, but it also cost us 2.5 years or 2 years of production time while those plants reestablished themselves and started producing fruit again. Now, if I had seen these two lines before we ever planted the Riesling, I could have had a data-driven conversation with my father, and we would have reached a different decision about what to plant. But because I didn't have this data, we didn't have that conversation. And my point is that even the smallest amount of data can have a dramatic impact on business performance. The role of people in the room, people like us, is to optimize the use of our data in order to achieve the best outcomes possible. One of those ways of doing that is by telling a story with this data. So this itself is a mini data story, right? You've learned a ton about me, maybe a little bit about the wine business as well. So coming up with a good story, you need to be very programmatic in terms of what you wish to achieve and how you go about doing it. So the first step is quite easy. Before you even start telling the story, underneath that pyramid, you need to first obtain the data and do the ETL on the data. And for all of us who work with data, that takes up a huge percentage of the time that it takes in order to get to that story point. So ETL, what I talked about yesterday was what does it take to make the data as useful as possible? And I think there are three things. One, understanding what are the dimensions, what are the KPIs, and what are the different categories, and then building taxonomies to allow mobility within the data to start at a very high level. For example, geographic areas, I call them time zones. So there are 3 time zones that we use at Microsoft. There is Asia, there is EMEA, and the Americas. And then from there, we'll drill down deeper and deeper and deeper till we get down to country, or in the US, we'll get down to district. But building up those taxonomies gives you mobility and flow to dive from a very high level to a very deep level and tell a story as it emerges there. And then finally, working with the data till you understand what is the story the data is telling you. And this is what are the key trends and facts and outcomes that are coming out of this data and your exploration of the data. And this is where I think Power BI can be very useful in that it allows you to pivot very quickly from one view to another view to see how different elements relate to each other and to pull out the essential truths that are in that data. And one of the really fun parts of my job is that I receive data sets from customers all over the world, and I have 2 or 3 days sometimes to understand what that data is, turn it around and present them something back in Power BI that is interesting and compelling. And if I can't do that very, very rapidly, then I lose them as a customer. So I've become quite adept in being able to go into a data set, figure out what is the essential components of that data set, but then turn it into something that is engaging and captures the imagination of the people with whom I'm working. And so the more I spend working with data, the more I think that I need to reach an endpoint where I'm entertaining as well as informing. So I see it as working in 3 components. The first is the data. This is a very basic one. The second is matching the visualizations to the data and to the outcome that you're trying to reach with that data. And then finally, taking those elements and building a coherent narrative with those elements. So I think one of the reasons why finance struggles so much to work well with data is that we don't think of ourselves as storytellers. Finance a lot of times, as it was with Microsoft, began as an accounting organization. And accountants are perhaps maligned, but have the reputation of not being very imaginative. And storytelling is, of course, incredibly imaginative. So we need to take ourselves from being technologists or being finance people or being accountants and change ourselves into being storytellers. Just like you sit down with your kids and tell a story, you want to sit down with your business partners and tell a story. So building your story, what does that take? Well, there is a number of narratives that jump out in virtually every business or organizational story. So what is the right action that you want to take? As in, some simple examples, things are looking good, but we're headed into troubled waters. We can look ahead and see challenges that we're facing. Or we're not where we're planning to be. We have a deviation from our forecast or a deviation from our budget. What steps should we take in order to get back to where we wish to be? Unexpected events happen that shake up our industry or our business or our model. What do we need to do in order to make adjustments to those and get back to a successful growth pattern? Or we're struggling in one area while we're very strong in another area. Do we wish to invest time to recover in the area where we're struggling, or would we shift resources into the area where we're doing well? You want to not only have those questions, but come up with the answers to those questions. So your story then has a beginning, a middle, and an end, a conclusion, a logical step that you want your business partners, your leaders, or your peers to take in order to, again, get to the best outcome possible. So for Microsoft, some of those themes are cloud transformation, moving to Office 365 and Azure from on-premises. How much do we use discounting when we're trying to close a sale? What does that do to our positioning within the marketplace, as well as to our P&L, to our financial performance? Do we want to be in devices at all? Should we have a phone or not? That's a big question, which we know the answer to. Annuity or non-annuity? Should we be selling as a service or selling as licensing? Pipeline. What is in the pipeline? What does the pipeline mean for future performance? And then, so you can see some of this comes from sales, which my last finance job was looking at sales. We have big deals in the pipe. What are our dependencies on those big deals in order to achieve our business outcome? And what are the risks of those deals not landing or not coming in the chord that we wish them to? So for your own business, think about the questions that arise most often and the stories you want to tell in answering those questions. So I think, I've been reading slides, but I want to differentiate storytelling from slide reading, because to me they're radically different. And you can, in a business presentation, you can tell who's really prepared and who's not prepared, because they will be reading a slide if they don't really know the material very, very well. They'll stand up and they'll just read out the slide. If you ask a question, you may go 1 layer deep, but you can't go 2 or 3 layers deep. And as an analyst, we need to be as deep into the data as anyone else in the business. And so in finance, as I said, when we started out, we were accountants, and our job was to make sure the credits match the debits. Now, over the past 15 years, Microsoft Finance has worked to make itself into trusted advisors for the leaders of our business. So we wish to be the first organization that Satya and his leadership team turns to when they want information about how to take the next step forward in the business. And that means we need to be far beyond just accountants. We need to know the business dynamics and the numbers around those business as well as anyone else there, and be able to tell that story in such a way that Satya feels informed and ready to make a decision. So set context, right? There's a starting point. Give everyone a picture, a basis on which to go forward, so you develop a common understanding. Focus on what's essential and weed out what's not essential. So often, people they'll run down a random path and the audience has no idea why they are going that way. So build a path that can be followed. You're going from one step to another step to another step. I think one of the best presentation classes I ever took 10 years ago or so was, imagine yourself building a bridge across a river where you're placing stones in the river to get your audience across from one bank to the other bank. So you'll have, say, 3 major stones, but then little stepping stones in between those. And how do you make it easy for people to cross from one bank to the other bank? So maybe that one works very well for me. Develop transitions, as I said, so one bank to another, one step to another step to allow them to follow you. I watch comedians a lot because I think they are master storytellers, and they all that they do is they get up in front of audiences, and day after day or night after night, they're telling stories. And each time they tell a story, they make a little refinement. Right? They'll test something out one night and see how it plays to the audience, test it out the next night and see, so they're constantly evolving what they're doing, but their whole purpose is to get everyone with a shared understanding. So that's why, Mike Birbiglia, I don't know if you guys know him, he's a G-rated comedian, which is why I feel free to bring him up. But he's a master at taking something that seems very innocuous or silly, and by 30 minutes later, people are roaring, they're falling in the aisles because he set it up in such a way from the very beginning that they can understand why it's funny. So it's called Massachusetts is the one I'm thinking of. NPR had this very silly story about he and his wife bringing their cat from New York to Massachusetts, which they called Massachusetts. And it's so dumb, but people loved it by the end. And then finally, finish by summarizing the journey that you've been on together. So give people something to lock onto and take away at the end. And so it's a pretty common story methodology. Is say what you're going to say it, and then say what you have said. And constantly reinforce that key message. So that when people walk out, that's the last thing in their minds is, what is that key message? So I think this is the end of my slides. Oh, yeah, so now we're into my demos. So if there are any questions now, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I will jump right into demos. Okay. So the background to this demo is that I was in a role where I was focused on sales. And so I was analyzing the sales pipeline. I was understanding, what it took to move from 180% coverage down to actual revenue. I was really deep at the customer level in analyzing our sales. And so, in the beginning of FY16, I built a data set where I was looking at our customers, and I was focused on just two very simple metrics. One was revenue, the other was revenue per customer. And so I started out with this. I pulled the data in the beginning of FY16 and used this just to understand customer behavior and where we were facing risks. So this is in a Power BI file, and this was the page that I was using. So it's pretty simple. On the top, I have key metrics around customers. So I have number of customers, 2 years of revenue, revenue year over year, then revenue per customer with that same look. And then I have two different layers of visualization. So the middle layer here is revenue by industry. I'm sorry, revenue by a number of dimensions that we look at very commonly. So the first is this geographic dimension. The second is the customer segment dimension, so commercial, government, or education. The third is internal segment, so how our sales force is split between EPG, our larger customers, and SMSMP, our smaller customers. And then the fourth is revenue split by industry. And then on the bottom, I'm looking at revenue per customer on a year-over-year basis. Cut here by geography, in this one cut by industry, and then the third is cut by customer segment. And then I had a little place where I could keep just some very brief notes as I'm working through observations. So the way that I would use this was perhaps the most useful, is I would drill down here from geography into this drill down path right here. So if I come into, I'll pick France. If I come into France, now I'm going from area to region. Now I'm at the customer segment, so I'm going to pick the commercial customer segment and come in, and then now we're at the organizational segment. So you can see the drill down path I have here mirrors the visualizations I've set up moving to the right. So I was fairly deliberate in putting that together. Now coming into customer segment, now I'm down at industry. And I can explore at the industry level what's going on. So if I pick banking and capital markets, you can see that it was our largest segment, and it suffered a 4% decline year over year. That in itself is pretty meaningful. Coming down to retail, retail did much better. It had 20% year over year growth. So from a Microsoft perspective, we'll always focus on areas to fix as opposed to areas where we're doing well. So banking stands out. The next one that I looked at was discrete manufacturing, which was 5.5% down year over year. Right? So I see two industries where I may want to focus my attention. Coming back to banking and capital markets now, I'm going to come down and drop from the industry to the customer level. So now these are our big banking customers identified by their customer ID number. If I select our biggest customer, $17 million customer, I see that, well, I need to disable that. Now I'm looking at this customer and see, wow, 6% decline. So this is actionable information, right? Our largest banking customer declined year over year by 6%. The next one down did pretty well at 5.9%, so I'm not so concerned about this one. The third biggest customer, 42% decline year over year, right? So now this one I'm clearly concerned about. I would be on the phone with the account manager saying, what's going on? What can we do to help get back on track with this? So I use this one quite a bit. I'm going to come back up. And then the next thing that I looked at was here, this year-over-year revenue per customer. And here it's colored by the time zones. So you see I have Asia, EMEA, Latin America, and North America. Green are EMEA countries, EMEA areas. Two of the areas in EMEA were doing fairly well, MEA and Germany. But 4 out of the 6 EMEA areas were not doing well. So I was concerned about EMEA as an overall area. Looking at the revenue per customer by industry, this was also quite interesting. I engaged with this, is some of our big segments like retail, process manufacturing, education, logistics, and public safety were down or very low in terms of year-over-year growth. So I put these two together, and I went to my manager, who's the CFO of EPG, and I asked her if this was a good place to invest my time, my analytical energy, to really figure out what was going on in EMEA and with these struggling industries. And she agreed with me that, yes, I should focus on this. It would be a good use of my time. So I began, one, looking at more data, but I also began talking to people that I knew around the company, and I also began going to meetings. So one of the meetings I went to was a compete meeting, where we were talking about how we were faring against our competition. And one fact that I learned was really interesting to me was that Google was targeting Microsoft customers and trying to convert them over to Google Apps, but the way in was through Gmail. So they would say, hey, buy Gmail. It was kind of like a gateway crime, right? Buy Gmail, and then they would use that as a hook to try and get them to get other apps. And it was material for Microsoft, from a revenue perspective. Every customer we lost was $1 million in lifetime revenue, and a 1% market share in the business productivity space was almost $200 million, right? So this was definitely material. I went and I So again, beginning of FY16, I went and I gathered some of this competitive data and I added it to my original customer data set. And then I created an Azure machine learning experiment to determine if what we were seeing, could I predict which customers were at risk of going to Gmail or to Google Apps. So the first thing, before I did the machine learning experiment, was I created this impact of going to Gmail. And so here I have a number of customers, again, the same type of setup with revenue year over year, revenue per customer, et cetera. But then I created this grid, which is pretty simple but pretty powerful. So on the horizontal axis, it was has Amazon Web Services. On the vertical axis, it was has Gmail. And what I observed is that out of the 88,000 customers going across 2 years, the bulk of them, 73,000, had neither, but that 2,300 had Gmail only, 3,500 had Gmail, 12,000 had AWS, 1,100 had both. So if I looked at just this 2,300, what I saw is that Microsoft's sales performance was negatively impacted by customers that had Gmail. If I looked at customers that had both, I saw, in fact, there was a positive impact. And this was really interesting, right? It was counterintuitive. What we ended up believing is that those customers who had Gmail only were trying to find a cheaper way of doing business. And so they thought Gmail or Google Apps was the way. What we thought about those customers that had both is that a small amount of number, 1,100 customers, they were experimenting, trying to figure out how do you transition from the old way of being on premises into the new world of being cloud. So they were overspending in IT while they figured out how to do this transition. It was a really interesting learning for us. But it also demonstrated to me that, yes, Gmail was having a negative impact. That sensation was reinforced by these two graphs. So this first one is revenue per customer, and the second one is revenue per customer year over year. So for those customers who did not have Gmail, meaning the no customers, it was higher in terms of revenue and in terms of year over year growth. While customers who did not have that, or who did have Gmail, were lower on both counts. Similarly, customers who did have Gmail had a higher percentage of downsell, meaning their year-over-year revenue went down, and a higher percentage of lost customers, right? So two very simple graphs, but there was a lot of learning to be had from them, and it verified kind of the concerns that I had. So I came back, and then the last graph I had on here was this one, where I was looking at customers percentage with Gmail and percentage of lost customers by geographic area. And what stood out for me is how all the areas in EMEA, the green areas, were down in the lower left of this box, meaning low percentage lost and low percentage with Gmail. So I was encouraged by this. I was heartened. So I'd spent a number of years living in Germany, so I knew a lot of people in EMEA. I was on the phone calling up the account managers I knew, saying, hey, it looks really good to me. It looks as if Google is not coming after us. And they said, you know what, Jeff? By this time, we were towards the end of FY16. They said, Jeff, in fact, you're wrong. What we've noticed in the past few months is really aggressive attacks by Google on our customer base. You need to repull your data. So I'm going to do two things right now. I'm going to transition from Power BI into ML. So I'm going to create the experiment in ML using the original data set. And then I'm going to get the data set I pulled towards the end of the year, the fresh data set, but just for EMEA. So I'm going to show you how that works. So coming into the ML Studio, I sign in, and then I'm going to create this experiment. So I'm going to start with a blank experiment, and I preloaded the data set. So I have this data set, which is called the churn data set. I'm going to pull it into the ML canvas. Here's what it looks like. So it is 51 columns in size, 88,000 rows, so exactly the same number that we were looking at before in Power BI. And then here's all the data. So as I was looking through this data in the original CSV file, I noticed that there were a lot of gaps, a lot of empty cells. So I needed to take care of that. I came down to data transformation, and pull in clean missing data. I connect those, and now it's going to take care of those empty cells. I then need to split the data between that data that I'm going to run the experiment on and the data that I'm going to be able to compare actuals versus predicted. So the fraction that I'm going to split and train on will be 0.7, changing from the default 0.5. The next thing to do is come down now to the ML section. So here's the machine learning section. I want to train the model. So I pull in train model and connect it up to the split data. And then I went, and I didn't do this on my own, but I went to a buddy of mine who works on the ML team, and I just asked him for advice on what package I should use. So there are 4 ways of using ML to drive predictive analytics. The first is doing regression. The second is clustering. Third is classification, and fourth is anomaly detection. So I was looking at classifying customers at being at risk of moving to Google or not. So I used the classification section and then came to 2-class boosted decision tree. So I pull that in and connect it right there. Now I need to say what element we're going to train the model on, and it's going to be the column has Gmail. So come here and come down to has Gmail, click check, and then the next step is to score the model, and scoring the model is essentially what makes it run. So I connect right here and then go back to the 30% and pull that down. And then finally, we need to evaluate the model. Was it a good model or not? So I pull an evaluate model, set that up, and now it's time to run the experiment. So it's going to run. It's going to take a couple minutes, but it's just going to click through and make sure each of those components is functioning. So there are the checks right there. And once that's done, then we can evaluate the model and determine if it's a good model or not. So what I'm looking for is a line that moves to the far upper left here, so true positive rate as opposed to false positive rate. So this looks pretty good. When I come down to accuracy, I see 96% accuracy. So feels like a pretty good model to me. Now, the next thing I want to do is, because I'm a finance guy, right? And so I'm going to be very frank, I'm not an expert at ML. I'm teaching myself how to do it. So it's a lot of fun, but I'm also a little nervous all the time. And I always like to go back to the medium where I feel very comfortable. So in this case, it's Excel. So what I'm going to do is set up a web service. And this will allow me to work with this model that I've created in machine learning, but do it from Excel. So it's going to do the same thing. Now it's transforming it to the web service. Once that's done, then I'm going to run this. And it will then activate it as a web service. And then I'm able to deploy back to Excel. Okay. I think my internet connection is a bit slow. Here's the last one, I think. Well, one of the things that I really value about ML is the fact that I don't need to be a data scientist. I can teach myself, and I have some friends who I can get help with. But I think this is taking data science out of the hands of data scientists and moving it into the hands of analysts. So now it's ready. I'm going to deploy the web service, and this will then allow me to work with this model in Excel. So Excel is going to open this up, my Excel file. I enable the editing. Okay, and so this is an Excel add-in, but it's a connection back to my Azure machine learning model. So now I'm going to get my new data set. So the data set that I pulled for just the countries in EMEA. So that is, sorry, hang on. Right here. So when we look at this is only 17,000 rows of data right here. So 16,896. But it has exactly the same column. So it's exactly the same data set, but just pulled fresh and then isolated for EMEA. So I'm going to move this input sheet over to my experiment sheet. So move or copy to the experiment. Okay, and then I'm going to highlight all of these cells and use them as the input range. So it's going to take all these cells and it's going to run these back up into the ML experiment. Then sheet 1 is where I'll get my output. I'll say A1, okay, and then got it. And so now I'm going to predict. And now it's going to take these 17,000 new rows of data, run them up into the experiment, run the experiment on this data, and then bring it right back down into Excel, again, the medium that I'm very comfortable with as a finance guy. So you see, it came back down. And when I come to the end, it's added 2 columns. So one is scored labels. The second is scored probabilities. So scored label is binary. It's 1 or 0. 1 indicating, yes, this customer is at risk. 0 indicating, no, the customer is not at risk. And then scored probabilities is the probability of this customer changing, in this case, 0.9989. So it seems like a fairly high probability. Now the next thing I'm going to do is copy this output, bring it back to my original data file and put it now in the input page, and then copy and paste. And let's go make sure we got it right. So 0.9989, so same number here. So now I'm going to come back and save this. And then in the original Power BI file, I'm going to come and get data. So I'll come down to the modeling section. Okay, and so now get data. ML output right there. Okay, so it's going to show me the input and the output tables. I'm just going to select the output table and bring it in. And let's edit it first to make sure everything's coming the way we want. So I'm going to scroll over and check out right there. So there's a scored labels, scored probabilities, 0.9989. So these are the same numbers. Close and apply. So now this new table with the ML output is being brought into Power BI. So now I'm linking these three technologies, Power BI, Excel, and machine learning. It made all the joins for me with the exception of segment. So I'm going to pull segment over, and so now I have this table now integrated into my data model. Now, the analytics I'm going to do are going to be quite simple, but also very effective. So first thing I want to do is understand how many customers do I have at risk. So to do that, I'm going to use this matrix visualization here. I'm going to get geography and get country. So that's called sub-region name. And then I'm going to come down to ML output and get the scored labels. And so now I see there are 1,600 customers in Europe which were identified as being at risk. And very interestingly, they're quite targeted in terms of geography, right? So UK, France, Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Switzerland, Belgium, Portugal, and Austria are being targeted. But countries that were not were Germany, the Scandinavian countries, and Ireland. You see this clear difference. Now, the next thing that we really look at a lot is industry. So I'm going to come to industry and bring in industry name. And so now I have this matrix here. And again, the only number of industries were being targeted, not all industries. So education, government, process manufacturing, professional services, and retail were all being targeted. Right? But others were not targeted at all. So to me, this meant that Google was being very deliberate in identifying those countries and those industries where they felt they could take share from us. I wanted to be even more, this is pretty actionable, right? Because I can be on the phone with Netherlands and say, hey, you have 83 customers in government that are being targeted. But I wanted to be even more precise than that. So the next thing I did was I got this table, and I'm going to, let me resize it, and get first by area, so I'm going to pull in area, and then I'm going to get country, industry, customer ID number, and I see it was aggregating these, but I want these to be individual, so I'll say don't summarize. So now these are individual customer ID numbers. Come down and get scored labels, scored probabilities, and revenue. Okay, so now here I have the revenue, and I'm going to sort it by revenue. And then I'm going to eliminate the scored labels, which are 0. So I'm just going to filter these out and say is not 0. Apply that. So now we just have those customers at risk. And now I can be super precise because I can say if I look at UK, 500 customers in UK. Now I have 500 customers in my table, but I have the exact customer ID numbers for those customers at risk in UK. And if I want to be more precise and say, listen, within process manufacturing, these are the 35 customers that are at risk. So now I can be on the phone with the account managers who own those accounts and say, listen, what can we do programmatically to offset this challenge that's coming from Google? So this is the finance guy sitting in Redmond who's taken a Power BI file from there, created a machine learning experiment, which helps me identify those customers at risk, and then taking action with the account managers. So this is really reaching a long way. And it was a really powerful exercise that we went through in order to address this. So any questions about this demo? I know there's a lot in it. Yes?
You were having that conversation. How were you guys on the same page?
The question was, if I was having that conversation with account managers, how are we on the same page? You mean visually? Well, I would share this with Skype for Business, right? And this was just very quick and dirty to show you, what the key elements of the information. I got a little fancier when I was presenting back to them, but I would share this through Skype for Business and then create a dashboard which I was able to share with those guys in the service. Yes? Question was, do I have any information about how successful our approach was? Meaning, how effective were we in fighting back against Google? Fairly effective. So, any other questions? Okay. So, you know, ML for me, like I said, I'm not an expert at it, but I'm teaching myself. It's so much fun to be able to do this because it feels like I can do so much. And I'm just on the edge personally of being able to do this. But I guess my message is anyone in this room could be doing this. It takes some investment in time and energy, but it can be done. Okay, so now I'm going to move to my next demonstration. And this one is much different. So I told you the story about the vineyard. After 2.5 years on the vineyard, my wife had had enough. So I met her at business school in Virginia. She's from Singapore. She's a very urban woman. She's also very flexible. So she was, you know, she did fine on the vineyard. She learned how to drive a tractor, and she was driving the tractor around, which I thought was really cool. But we were far outside of Portland, far outside of the city, and she just felt like it was too far. I remember one time we drove with my son into Portland, and he started picking flowers from people's flower boxes to give to my wife. And he was just such a hick that it was kind of shocking to me. So, at any rate, we weren't making a lot of money, so I started working again at Microsoft as an hourly worker for my original boss, Mark Regera, who's also at the conference. Mark's manager saw me. She was the CFO of the Surface business, and she said, Jeff, I want you to come and work for me. So I was working for her as a contract worker. She said, Jeff, I want to rehire you as a full-time employee, and you can work in Redmond, you can go back to Asia, or you can go live in Europe. And I never lived in Europe before and was really excited to. So I said, yeah, I'll move to Europe. And then I had my choice of outside of London in the Thames Valley, or in Paris, or in Germany, which is where the services vice president was for EMEA. So I chose Munich in large part because of how close it is to the Alps. I love skiing, and so being an hour and a half from the Alps was awesome. So we moved to Germany. This is a picture of my family. This is my younger son, Walter. He was born on the vineyard, so he was 1.5 when we moved. My older son, Vernon, was 4 by the time we got to Germany. There's my wife. We wanted to have a very European lifestyle, so I had a company car, a BMW, that I drove on the Autobahn to work, 240 kilometers an hour. It was a blast. For my wife, I got her this beautiful bicycle and wagon. That arrangement lasted about 2 months, and then my wife came and said, Jeff, we're going to be even more European. You're going to take the train to work. I'm taking the car. But for 2 months, I was golden, right? So we moved to Germany. We thought we'd spend two years there, which is kind of the typical expat period of time. But we were having such a great time that we ended up staying 4.5 years. And let me show you why. So part of the reason why is that we were staying in one room at the house down on the vineyard. We moved into a house. So this is us after 4.5 years in the Italian Alps just before we moved back. You can see the boys are much bigger boys, right? They're not little kids anymore, they're big boys. And then down here, so where we lived was, if you've ever been to Munich, one of the great tourist attractions is called the Schloss Nymphenburg. Construction started in, you've been there? 1575, kind of in competition with Versailles, which they'd begun in the 1550s, right? So the Bavarian kings were jealous of the French kings. They wanted something to match them. We lived down to the end of the Schloss Canal, so this mile-long canal, right down here in this house right here. So it was built in 1880, the original parquet floors, 4.5-meter ceilings, right? It was awesome. It was fantastic. We loved it. My wife loved it. In wintertime, I know how to ski. I'm a great skier, but not a good ice skater. So I taught myself to ice skate on this pond right here when it froze over. And then we would drive down 1.5 hours into Austria to go skiing every weekend. And then in summertime, we drove to Spain, to Portugal, across to France, to Germany, Denmark, Scandinavia, to Budapest, Italy. So all over the place, having a great time, ready to stay even longer until my older son, Vernon, came to me and he said, Papa, I don't want to go back to America. I just want to stay in Germany and be German. And then I knew it was time to go back to America. So I went to my wife, I wrote Roisin, I said, Roisin, time to move back to Seattle. So I grew up in Seattle, right where we are now. This is where I grew up, and I think it's a great town. I love it. I've lived all over the U.S., but I love Seattle. The east side, where Microsoft is a different story, right? That's the other side of the lake. It's kind of the sticks. It's not cool. I said, we're moving back to Seattle, and my wife said, yeah, it's fine to move back to the U.S., but we're not moving to Seattle. We're moving to the east side of the lake near Microsoft because I don't want you commuting 1.5 hours home every night across the 520 bridge. This was one of those times when I'd finally been married long enough that I didn't try and have a conversation with my wife about it. I just agreed. But I didn't want to, because this was my life in Seattle. So I grew up in this house right here. This blue is where the blue column is. Elementary school right there. My brother still lives in the hood right there. High school was up here in the north part of Seattle. Graduate school at University of Washington right there. I went sailboat racing where these orange columns are. So these are marinas. My favorite restaurants are these purple columns, and then all my high school buddies still live right around there in these light blue columns. And then I would drive across the 520 bridge, go to work at Microsoft, work all day because it was the uncool side of the lake. I would quickly move back to the cool, or drive back to the cool side. But then my wife said, no, we're living on the east side. So I really had to educate myself about what that meant from a family perspective in particular. So this is what it meant, is that I needed to find schools for my kids. So these are the yellow columns. The light green columns, or lime green columns, are tennis clubs. In Germany, my wife had started playing tennis very competitively, so she wanted to join a tennis club. The orange columns were marinas on the east side of Lake Washington for sailboat racing. And then the dark green columns were soccer clubs, so European football clubs. And this, in fact, was the test of my worth as a father. And the reason why is we got to Germany, my wife from Singapore. Now, maybe you've heard the term tiger moms. Well, my wife is a total tiger mom. I say that to her, she's not, but really she is. So she got to Germany and she thought, what is the thing that my kids can get from Germany that they can't get anywhere else in the world? And of course the answer was soccer. So she went down to the local soccer club, which is called FT Gern, and she met the manager of the club, this German woman named Frau Lahm. And she said, Frau Lahm, I would like my son Vernon, 4 years old, to play football. Frau Lahm gave us back a very German answer, not possible. And there were two reasons why it wasn't possible. Now, the given reason was that tryouts had been the 3 weeks previously, and we would have to wait a whole year till tryouts came around again. This is for the 4-year-olds. But I think the real reason was Frau Lahm did not believe that this little American boy was as good as the German boys. And she didn't think he would be good enough to be on the team. But Frau Lahm did not understand my wife. My wife just kept coming back and coming back and coming back. It was the immovable German object against the unstoppable Singaporean force. Eventually, my wife was victorious. My son was allowed on the team. We had hot dogs, frankfurters that night for dinner, great celebration. I took my son down to practice the next day. Immediately, two huge problems. The first problem, Frau Lahm was totally right. My son was horrible at soccer. He was not nearly as good as the German kids because the fathers would wait outside of the delivery room at the hospital for the son to be born, right? They're waiting there holding the ball saying, come on, I want to play. Every day while the kid's crawling around the father's kicking the ball to him. So by the time they're 4 years old, they're good players. The second problem was my son didn't speak German, and the German coaches were not like the nice American coaches. They were hard German coaches. So they just yelled at him in German, telling him how much he sucked at soccer. And while he may not have understood the words, he definitely knew what they meant. So this poor little boy crying on the field, but he was tough. He stuck with it over the course of 4 years. He went from being the worst to kind of being the top third, but on the ascent, knowing that when he came back to the U.S., he was going to be the king of soccer. So if I didn't find him the best soccer club, I would have failed as a father. So these were the things I was thinking about. I went to my brother, who's a real estate agent in Seattle, and he got me 60,000 rows of housing sales from the multiple listing service. So you can only download 2,000 rows at a time, so he did 30 downloads to get me this data set. But it's the data set for King County, covering 2.5 years of sales. So I took this data and I split it into 4 regions. I have Seattle, north of Seattle, south of Seattle, and east of Seattle. And if I focus in on the east, this will bring us to... So here's east of Seattle, and then I picked 4 neighborhoods to concentrate my search in: Greater Bellevue, Old Bellevue, and the tech suburbs of Redmond, Kirkland, and Juanita. So aligning very closely to these columns right here. Now I had some very hard measures. So you guys may have read about real estate in Seattle. It's horrendous. I had a budget, it was $1 million or less. I mean, it's a huge amount, but nonetheless, that's what I had to pay. I wanted to have value for my money, so I thought of this in terms of dollars per square foot. So I had a limit of $400 per square foot or less. I wanted to have a big yard for my kids to play in, so I wanted an acre in size if possible. And then I wanted to live in a craftsman-style house. So craftsman architecture is predominant on the west coast of the U.S., built before 1930 pretty much. And it makes use of all the great natural materials in the Northwest, like the fir trees and the cedar trees, the big river stones, to make gorgeous fireplaces or columns. It's the type of house I grew up in, and I wanted to have that same place for my kids. So these are the things I was thinking about. I cut the data these different ways. So the first is by selling price. So when you look at this, you can see immediately where it's cheap or where it's expensive to live in Seattle, right? Red columns along the lake are the most expensive places to live. This Capitol Hill and Madison Park here and out here on Queen Anne are expensive residential areas. The rest is cheap. Around Microsoft, I was a yellow or blue guy. Around Microsoft, I could see plenty of houses that were yellow or blue. So I felt confident I could find a house near my workplace that I could afford. The second cut, I became interested in this area right here. So this area had a mix of pink and yellow, pink being outside of my price range, yellow being inside of my price range. And this was particularly interesting when I came to the dollars per square foot view and focused in on the same area because there was no pink here. And what this meant to me was that it took me a while to understand what it meant that houses were bigger here, so there was more square feet to offset the selling price. And I was back in my American mode, out of my European mode, back in American mode. Bigger is better than smaller, so I was looking in this area. And the next one was lot size. So as you might expect, in the center of Seattle, there is where houses are most dense, right? So dark blue are the smallest lots. As you move north or south, they get bigger. Moving east, bigger yet. So by the time you get up to the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, houses are really big. But in the same area where I'd been focused, there were hundreds of houses that had huge lots. And so despite the fact I only grew up, this is only about, say, 8 miles away, 6 miles away, I never knew that there was this huge park here, 600 acres of uncut forest, surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of houses where people had horses. So if you want to have a horse and pretty much live in the metropolitan area, this is where you live. And I didn't want a horse, but I did want the property that came with a horse. So I was looking here, more focused here than ever. I came to year built as a proxy for craftsman-style houses. So in Seattle, the dark blue houses are houses built before 1930, which means that high probability that they're craftsman houses. So these are the houses I grew up in. When you come to the east side, there's no dark blue on the east side. It's an architectural wasteland over there. Part of the reason why I never wanted to live there in the first place. And as soon as I saw this, I realized there was no point in trying to find a craftsman-style house because they just didn't exist on the east side. So I struck that from my list. And feeling that I understood the market well, I began my search in earnest. I'd come into the office in the morning, find a house, call my brother, call my wife, we'd meet, we walk through. And at that time, Microsoft had put us in this tiny little corporate apartment, about 700 square feet, surrounded by people everywhere. I was just going crazy, it was so noisy. So I was desperate to find a house. We walked through a house, I said, that's great, let's buy it. My wife, as you might expect, had a different viewpoint. She said, nope, I want the perfect house. So we looked at house after house after house, couldn't find one. And I was getting frustrated, but also worried, because at this time, this was 2013, we were coming out of the housing recession here in Seattle. Prices were rising. And so my feeling was every day that we waited, we would get less house for our money. I'd say this to my wife, she'd say, I don't care, we're gonna get the perfect house. So we were at odds. I didn't know how to solve this until I created a metric to measure the heat of the market. So this metric is called the list-sell ratio. If you list your house for $100,000 and you sell it for $110,000, that gives you a ratio of 1.1. So it means the market is hot. If you take that in aggregate, right? If you list your house for 100, you sell it for 90, that means it's a cold market, again, taken in aggregate. So when I apply this list-sell ratio over time, watch what happens over those 2.5 years of data as the market goes from primarily yellow and blue, meaning neutral or cold, to more and more pink and red coming into the market. So you see it popping here and here and down here and out here and right here and then up in the area where I was looking, right? I could see the market heating up in front of my eyes. I showed this to my wife. She agreed with me. She saw it too. So now we were united by data in our urgency to buy a house. And I will show you where I ended up. So this is the sailing club I ended up joining. Here is the office at Microsoft called Red West, where I was working. This is the football club for my boys down at Merrimore Park. The tennis club that we ended up joining is right there. And the school for my boys is right there, called Ben Franklin. Our house is right there. 5 minutes walk to tennis, 5 minutes walk to school, 10 minutes on my bicycle down to work, on 1.1 acres of land below my $1 million limit. So this is how I use data to buy a house. But this is also the storytelling skill that we're trying to build up in Microsoft Finance to drive business results. So no longer do I want to go in at the beginning, at the end of a month to review sales performance for that month with a 100-page PowerPoint deck. I want 5 or 6 slides in Excel or in in Power BI where I'm able to tell a story, where I'm able to have a narrative starting at the beginning and moving towards the end, at the end of which we have this common understanding about what's most important to the business and what actions I recommend as the finance guy to take steps forward. So in this example, this is far removed from any business example, but it's nonetheless, I think, it's a pretty good story, and I think I hope it's taught you a lot, right? So I hope that you know where it's expensive in Seattle, where it's not expensive, where lots are big, where lots are small, where craftsman-style houses are, et cetera. You know what was important to me, my budget, price per square foot, that I wanted a craftsman-style house, right? So we're united by this. In 10 minutes, you guys are now experts on Seattle real estate. And this is what I wish to do every month, no matter what business I'm in, is be able to tell a story and motivate people in exactly the same way. So thank you very much.